Welcome to Shaping the Future podcast. In this episode, I'm speaking to Professor Jason Box of the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland. We are discussing how the colossal Greenland ice sheet is changing as the Earth warms and what impact this will have on the global climate system. So much of Jason's work bridges the void between climate science in obscure corners of the planet and the risks posed by pollution from industry, as well as how we in wealthier countries conduct our lives. Shaping the future means envisioning the world we want and committing to a pathway to achieve it. In that vein, we end this discussion by considering the social movements that are emerging as part of the growing awareness of the necessity to change. Thank you for listening, and please do subscribe on whatever podcast channel you use to hear more forthcoming episodes. Okay, Jason, thanks for taking the time today. I want to ask you about Greenland. Greenland is cited in many warnings about the damage we're doing by pumping tens of billions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. And can you talk a bit about your work on Greenland, what you're seeing, what that means, and how it integrates with the climate system as a whole? And start just by telling us a bit about what your job entails at the Geological Survey of Denmark.
Okay. So I took a job at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland 7 years ago already. It's a job focused on a couple of things. One is keeping a network of on-the-ground measurements running to produce, the idea is to produce kind of authoritative kind of ground truth for all of the satellite and model work that's done to assess how the Greenland ice sheet is reacting to climate warming and climate variability. So those kind of relatively low-tech ground observations are quite useful for checking the high-tech satellites and models. Mm-hmm. Another aspect of my work is using the models and satellite data to get at other parameters in understanding the Greenland ice response to climate change and even the broader Arctic. So Greenland in context of the Arctic. And recently been taking a wider view, supporting some studies and reports that look at the whole Arctic system, even the interaction of the Arctic climate system with the rest of the world. And we see lots of connections. It's like kind of everywhere you look, you find the interconnection of things, and you realize that changes in our climate system are not local.
That's one of the things that I found really interesting, is how Greenland, with this enormous ice sheet, actually fits into and influences the climate system. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Greenland ice sheet, of course, is an enormous reservoir of land ice. And by virtue of its enormous volume, it actually has a quite delayed response to climate perturbations. The current human-caused climate change is really fast in the context of the response time of such a large ice sheet. So because of that delayed or slow response, it's useful to think about the lost commitment that we're starting to make because it will take time for this ice sheet to fully respond to the abrupt climate changes that have already been committed. So that's precisely the high level work that I'm on right now, is evaluating the disequilibrium of the Greenland ice sheet with the current and projected climate. And so then you get an idea of committed sea level rise.
Okay. So you're talking about lost commitment. So basically the heating of the atmosphere that is causing the melting is causing sea level rise and more runoff. And because it's a system, it's it's committing us to certain future scenarios. Is that what you mean?
It's because the shape of the ice sheet, it has this kind of parabolic shape, and it takes time for that shape to adjust to changing the increase in the bare ice area during summer. That happens at the lower 1/3 of elevation. You have melting concentrated down low. But the warmer the climate gets, the higher the snow line and the melt line goes up. And precipitation patterns are changing with more rainfall instead of snowfall. This also has the effect of pushing the melt area higher, on this dome-shaped ice sheet.
Right.
But those effects will take time, even millennia, to fully be realized in terms of the important changes to the shape of the ice sheet.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, as we heat up climate, we are seeing new records set for melting, but those are like single years. And the full response of really the shape of this dome of ice, it takes decades, centuries, millennia to fully respond in its dynamic flow to changing meltwater, infiltrating to the bed, for example, providing lubrication to flow, the erosion of marine terminating tidewater glaciers. There many of those have retreated. That has a dynamic effect of increasing the flow because there's less flow resistance. And so the dynamic factors will more directly influence the shape of the ice, much more actually than these year-to-year changes, which just remove a few meters at a time. The dynamic thickness change and slumping effects can thin the ice much more rapidly, like 10 meters per year kind of thing. It can be 10 times more important.
And do they sort of, when you talk about the slumping, surely that's something collapsing inside?
Right. I mean, even that slumping can take years to happen. And so it's a gradual process. The greatest kind of thinning rates can be, say, 10, 20 meters in a single year, but that would be really focused at the tidewater glacier fronts. And whereas that's a small fraction of the whole area. The thickness changes from surface melting alone, those play out over much wider areas. And so by virtue of the larger area, they do add up in ways that outcompete the thickness changes from dynamic flow. So there's this competition between surface melts and surface climate effects, and then like the internal dynamics. Which of these factors contributes to a greater loss? It's kind of neck and neck. And at this point, I'm wondering if there's some kind of homeostasis, if you will. There's some kind of feedback between the thickness changes due to surface melting and the thickness changes due to ice dynamics. These two effects, of course, are interactive because surface melting produces water which lubricates the flow, or the surface water again can lead to like a hydrofracture process, because water acting under gravity can exert more force at the bottom of a fissure than the surrounding ice. So hydrofracturing is very much a clear interaction of the surface melt process with the ice dynamics.
When you're talking about these two processes, it reminded me, in a previous conversation, you talked about the ice sheet as a threshold system, and you just talked about loss commitment. Are those compatible sort of descriptions of these two processes?
Yes, I really prefer to talk about thresholds instead of tipping points, and it's a subtle difference. But I think the point is, you can say that an ice sheet like Greenland indeed is beyond its threshold of viability today. That is, if the current climate keeps up as is, it's merely a matter of time until practically all of that ice is ablating. And of course, now we're talking about many meters of sea level rise. Because it's a factor of time, the question becomes, is that response occurring at a rate that is relevant for all of the other concerns that humans have? And
rate of change was kind of my next question. And have you detected any acceleration, or is it steady? Or you've got two processes. I mean, it sounds quite complex to just say it's this or this, but what are you noticing about rates of change?
Yeah, it's right. It's kind of academic to talk about a tipping point, or even whether or not we're on one side of a threshold, because again, it takes time for that disequilibrium to manifest in a significant amount of sea level rise. That said, we also know that the Greenland ice and actually Arctic climate in general wasn't obviously responding to climate warming until after the mid 1980s. As recently as the mid 80s, you couldn't say with any real confidence that, using statistical tests or even just your own eyeballs looking at a graph, that climate of the mid 80s was any different from the climate of the previous century. But after the mid 80s, it becomes quite clear, looking at a graph or making statistical tests, that indeed the climate was accelerating out of a stable climate state, which was still noisy. The climate has noise. You can
Sure.
think about it as, the year-to-year weather, and you need to look at beyond a 30-year time scale to start to see real climate change. At this point, when you have 50 years of data since 1970, which we do. We've got good records on land ice, sea ice that go back more than 40 years. So it's more than this kind of 30-year time, and then you really start to see an acceleration. It's you see, so temperatures over Arctic land, over the Arctic Ocean, they are increasing in a accelerating way. Just temperatures. Land ice, that was stable in the 1980s, and then it comes out of a stable period. So clearly that's an acceleration as well. And I think that's the key message now. And I wouldn't have said this 5 years ago, but now, year 2020, looking at the observations, there are clear signals of accelerating warming in the Arctic and accelerating land ice loss. It's obvious looking at the data.
And when you come back to your description of a threshold system, as academic as this might be, there comes a point where when you're beyond your threshold, it becomes very hard to get back to where you are. And with the dynamics inside the ice sheet, it seems that there must be concern or a risk to all of us, really, that if we carry on, or maybe we have, gone beyond the threshold, I don't know, but it seems that that's a major risk, that if you're seeing the accelerating, and you can't say one way or the other, but is it something that concerns you?
I think it's still true that even though we are beyond Greenland's threshold of viability already, it's still valid to emit less carbon into the atmosphere or draw down carbon out of the atmosphere, because the climate will respond by warming less or even by stabilizing. So that would then slow down this process that it has started to produce an acceleration in sea level. That is now confirmed. Sea level rise is accelerating. And that was only a few years ago. And you had to remove El Nino, the kind of wide swings in sea level you get from El Nino. You remove those out of the curve, and then you just get a much more steady accelerating curve, just like ocean heat content. If you look at those data, you see the ocean heat content accelerating.
Okay.
But if we can take our feet off the gas pedal and in effect, stop adding CO2 as quickly to the atmosphere, in effect, we would be altering the initial conditions in a non-linear kind of exponential process so the actions that we take now can have really large consequences into the future. And I think therefore there will always be a difference between business as usual and a more kind of sane climate policy. We seem to be drifting toward a more sane climate policy despite obfuscation from industry and
sure
and so on. But then the question, I guess, you would be, is it ever too late at some point?
I think part of the reason for studying this podcast series is because the pandemic lockdown has given us some existential thinking space from business as usual.
Yeah.
And how we shape the future is based on a number of choices. There's someone else, I think Kevin said in the last one, it's not predetermined. We choose it, and the, these are some of the reasons of what you're saying is why it is so important to think about these things. And you mentioned a moment ago the oceans in terms of sea level rise and the heat in the oceans. One of the things that's visual from satellites is the this cold blob in the North Atlantic. And correct me if I'm wrong, but is that from runoff from melting water off Greenland?
I think it's compelling that the deglaciation of Greenland and the Canadian Arctic are contributing to the cold blob south of Iceland, this conspicuous area of the globe that's the only area on the globe that is actually cooling while the rest of the surface is heating. And okay, what's the cause of this? There's still a debate in the oceanography community, but the way I see it, it's between a group who has very short detailed records, mm-hmm. and another group who has long, less detailed records. And in the long, less detailed records, you have compelling evidence that the deglaciation of the Arctic, Greenland and Arctic Canada in particular, are contributing to this disruption of the North Atlantic thermohaline circulation. When you look in the really short records, yes, they're more detailed and precise. You simply lack the period of time to detect a trend. Sure. And so that community is saying, no, there's no trend. And so there's a gap in the available information. So if you accept the less detailed, longer term information, I think it's pretty convincing. But to be fair, the ocean circulation system is extremely complicated. It has all these layers in the vertical that are very important. And then you've mm-hmm. got then currents that are exchanging at different vertical levels in the ocean. And there's internal variability like El Nino in the ocean that complicates assigning a trend over even 30 years. You need centuries to have a lot of confidence. So the debate kind of rages on.
But it does seem that you can't just melt. I don't know. I couldn't even begin to think how many tons of ice it is off Greenland and the Canadian Arctic, which pours into the oceans, and not have some sort of feedback from that.
8,000 tons per second on average. Wow. That's what Greenland is losing. The whole Arctic is losing the equivalent of 14,000 tons per second.
And I mean, you can't even conceive that number, that volume.
Right. It's almost the flow of the Mississippi River. It's 170 times the flow of the Thames River. But the Thames is not a huge river. No. It's it's several times the Danube. It's less than the Amazon, which is the world's greatest river. But so the Mississippi, which is the North America's largest, it's almost that flow. Another way to think about it is if you took the fresh water that's currently being lost from Greenland, the last 10-year average, and divided it out by all 7.6-ish billion people on planet Earth, each person would get 150 liters per day, every day. And so a bathtub of water per person per day. So it's accumulated to something like about 10,000 cubic kilometers of additional fresh water into the North Atlantic in the last century.
We talked a bit about, that's colossal. And we talked a little bit about the delay, if you like, in such a large system like the Greenland ice sheet. You don't see changes instantly. It takes time. And obviously the Greenland ice sheet sits within another, the Earth system, which itself is highly complex with lots of interrelated subsystems, if you like.
I've had this focus on Greenland for most of my career, and only recently, by participating in some whole Arctic climate assessments, have I just been able to have the opportunity to think as the Arctic as a broader system,
Mm-hmm.
and even the interaction of the Arctic system with, say, the Northern Hemisphere system. I really was grateful for that opportunity to take a whole Arctic perspective after having these Greenland tunnel vision for the first 20 plus years of my career.
Yeah.
Because you really see interactions like in a year that's melting Greenland like crazy, it's actually freezing Svalbard, which is downstream in the planetary wave in the atmosphere, the jet stream,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa. You have a cold year in Greenland is a warm year in Svalbard. And so while one region is having a record melt or freeze, the other region is the opposite.
Yeah. When you're looking at these sort of embedded systems and overall complex systems, and it takes so long for them to sort of change before our eyes, if you like, you can't just press stop. So if we've got a trajectory or a commitment to reduce our net emissions to 0 by 2050, that's adding to the existing burden since the Industrial Revolution. And in a way, that if we can achieve that, then fantastic. The reversing or the stopping of the, I don't want to call it collapse, but it just sort of, melt of Greenland at this accelerating rate. Are they compatible or are they incompatible, do you think? I mean, I'm not trying to sort of belittle any kind of emissions reduction, because I think it's absolutely imperative and much faster than we're currently committed. But I'm just saying that, are there certain things that it will take longer to turn around in your view, or is there anything that you're seeing that would indicate that?
Right. The emissions reductions will slow down this kind of runaway train. It's like a train that's on a hill that's losing its brakes, and reducing emissions are kind of keeping the brakes more in control than without. But nonetheless, it's accelerating downhill. It's still getting faster. When you look at what it would take to draw down atmospheric carbon, the numbers get really big, and the scaling that up in a sustainable way looks practically impossible. And that would be to stabilize or even to get down to, so stabilizing would be one, say net zero.
Yeah.
The technology and the scale of the carbon drawdown necessary to neutralize the existing emissions is just a colossal project that conversation has only just begun. And so we won't see that type of stabilization anytime soon. But then you've got these wild cards like COVID. I think we're going to see quite a lot of scientific assessment coming out about that impact. What I've seen so far is that it's taken a dent out, but it obviously hasn't produced net zero kind of carbon fluxes. But I wanted to get really to the ultimate point, which is, as I see it, we can talk all day about cutting emissions or even starting to ramp up carbon drawdown measures, which I think are essential. But here's I think the bottom line is these measures, these evasive maneuvers need to happen before drought undermines food security to the point that areas affected by drought would become ungovernable. The people who can't feed themselves become ungovernable.
sort of drivers
And
of conflict.
yeah, so I think there's clearly there's the potential for drought related conflict to spiral out of control, to a point when there's no real prospect to regain stability because we go into a Mad Max kind of world. So that's I think obviously the risk trajectory that we're on. And I don't think it's too hyperbolic to talk Mad Max, considering the demonstrated effects that we've seen drought on, leading to civil conflict in places like Syria.
Sure.
And the whole north. Yeah, so that could be the factor that takes us, that prevents us from achieving kind of a better world in the future.
I think it's interesting that you can go from talking about the emissions from largely developed countries and how we commission emissions from developing countries, but to have the impact on something like the Greenland ice sheet, to a pathway to a future that we really don't want, and actions that we can take. It's sort of the complexity of the social system that's overlaid onto the natural system, and how our fates are completely entwined. I think it's one thing we really need to get a grasp of quite quickly, and especially a policy.
I think sadly and most alarmingly, there is a political class who realizes this type of dire situation could be exploited to their advantage. That an actor like Trump or Bolsonaro, that type of political figure, could actually use that type of destabilization of political systems to their advantage, because political actors, they're opportunistic and they're deeply cynical. People like Trump, would see opportunity in any crisis, as even if it's at the expense of billions of people. And
sure,
so that's a scary thought.
It's a scary thought, but if you flip that over, in the last couple of years, and I've talked to others about this, we've seen the rise of organizations, even if they're decentralized, like Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future, which is creating a kind of new awareness of a future we want that's challenging. There seems to be a line now, and it's allowing us to choose. These sort of tangible effects of climate change seem to be getting into people's psyche. I think that's a good sign from what I can see.
Yeah, I had a lot of hope from Extinction Rebellion. What occurred to me is, for the first time, we see the union of social and physical science. That's a really powerful combination, because prior to that, you had physical science outcrying like, oh, look at the temperature going up and the ice is melting. And then the social science, which realizes there are specific ways that movements are successful or fail. And so Extinction Rebellion's done quite well to mine historical information and social theory to develop a prescription for a social movement that could succeed, and then even offering this citizens assembly as a mechanism by which we could regain, we could empower true democracy. So we now just need to see, say, a citizens assembly and the demands of Extinction Rebellion implemented. If even on a local scale, a national scale, if Extinction Rebellion could achieve that in Great Britain, or if a similar movement could achieve that even at a local scale, and I think there may even be some examples of that, then you would see a demonstration of the regaining kind of justice and equity,
Sure.
environmental justice, all kinds of equity can flow from a genuinely democratic process.
And I think that that notion of equity is now provenly tied to the pathway to a brighter future. It seems to be fully embedded in a must do as opposed to a nice to have.
Yeah, right. I think neoliberalism has generated such a level of inequality economically, and environment has not been considered. So you see a total marginalization of the externalized environmental impacts of deregulated capitalism. That clearly is non-sustainable. It's obvious. So that system, which is deeply unequal, needs to be replaced by one which actually ensures that everyone, including the environment, has a chance, of survival. So I think we can put our finger on all of this. We know in principle what's needed. Mm-hmm. It becomes the challenge of how to put it into practice.
Implementation. I think that's a very good place to end this podcast. It's a challenge. It's one of the things an action point, if you like.
Yeah,
so thank you very much.
Yeah, it's great to zoom out and talk about this stuff.